Well, thank you. That's truly the kindest introduction I have ever received. And I'm very honored to be here at the Growth Lab because we're all here because we know there's a big problem of government debt, sovereign debt around the world. And one of the most important things to get out of the debt problems, particularly in Africa and the poorest countries, is growth. And I think the path-breaking work being done by the Growth Lab in a lot of countries to come up with better growth plans is an essential part of fixing the problem of the world. There is debt relief, there is debt restructuring, there are multilateral loans, there's negotiations with China, but growth is the big piece of it. And I hope we will see more of this great work going forward. The talk today, we'll keep it short, like 20 minutes, 25 minutes, because Q&A is important. We're going to talk about the impossible problem of sovereign debt restructuring, particularly two pieces of it, looking at Argentina's saga from its default in 2001 on about $100 billion worth of debt through 2016, when most of that was settled. I will include in the presentation 2 audio clips from court so you can hear the drama and how the arguments were made, which is much better than I could possibly write or say, and also 1 video clip. But in the Q&A, it will be fun to talk about Javier Milei and what's happening now, which features a few of the characters from my story, and also talk a little about the US debt. I've committed I will not speak without mentioning US debt. US deficit this year, 1.8 trillion. Argentina's whole economy, 600 billion. So you can fit 3 Argentine economies in our deficit. We have a problem. We need to always talk about it, because if we don't get that under control, it's going to hurt everybody. But enough of speech fun. Let's talk about Argentina. Sovereign debt restructuring. And I'll follow this timeline, and that will be the only slide. But sovereign debt restructuring has 2 impossible problems. The first one's called the holdout creditor problem. The essential problem is countries can't file for bankruptcy. You've all heard of Chapter 11, right? In the newspaper. This or that company filed for protection from creditors under Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Code. Well, countries don't get to file for protection. They default and they get sued and sued. And in Argentina cases, it was hundreds of lawsuits that went on for 15 years. Now, we call it the holdout creditor problem because generally creditors want to solve the problem, but what if half the creditors or 70% of the creditors agree on a deal? If you don't have a mechanism like a bankruptcy, what about the guys who say, well, I don't want to take the deal and I'm going to keep suing you, binding them in? So that's the holdout creditor problem, which is the biggest problem when you don't have a bankruptcy process. That's the first fundamental impossible problem of sovereign debt restructuring without sovereign bankruptcy. The second one is sovereign immunity. And I like to say it's because the judge in the case is in New York and Argentina's down in South America. And if Argentina does not want to obey a ruling of the court, it will not. Now, that's the practical effect. It's hard for a foreign judge to have sovereignty jurisdiction over a foreign party, but in reality, international law and US law and English law, they all protect sovereigns. In the old days, you couldn't sue a foreign country, you couldn't try to collect from a foreign country. We changed our law in the 70s to make it easier to sue and a bit easier to collect, but it's still, there's a very high bar. And we will talk about that because countries generally don't want diplomatic problems with countries because their private parties are suing them. So the law makes it hard, but on top of that, it's hard because the country may have no assets here and just not obey. So the Argentina story brings together these 2 impossible problems in the worst possible configuration. The worst, most aggressive holdout creditors in all of human history, with the most intransigent country who was dedicated to not obeying the court. That's why the fighting went on for 15 years. And that's not normal. I worked with Jamaica. And it took 3 months in 2010 for us to restructure all their domestic debt. Nothing was in the paper. There were no lawsuits. Was it pleasant behind closed doors? No. But did it spill out? No. Was it contained? Yes. And unfortunately, that program went off track and we had to do it again in 2013. And again, we did it in 3 months. And I looked at Argentina. I'm like, how did that take 15 years? It took me 7 years to write this book. It took me 7 years to go through every mistake made. Why did it take 5 years to do this deal? From the default to getting the first deal done in 2005 was like 4 years. And then you had this tail of litigation. This is the messiest deal ever. But so at the beginning here, we start with this default in December around 23rd, 24th, 2001. Argentina, and we don't talk in my book, and we won't talk now, why did Argentina default? It was in a Great Depression. It had way too much debt. It had a fixed currency. Everyone knew it had to default. So there's no big moral thing. They were bad people who default. Sometimes countries default and you have to clean up the mess. So my mechanical question is, why did it take 15 years and not 3 months? Not a big guilt story over defaulting. We need a cleanup mechanism. This one didn't work. So we start here. Argentina defaulted. Now, we'll go to court to hear a description of what it was like in Argentina then. So we go actually to court 10 years later. The courts are very frustrated with Argentina, and this starts with the nice judge. This is the appeals court. The liberal judge, Judge Pooler, at the end of an hour-and-a-half session, says to Argentina's lawyer, "Oh, Mr. Blackman, can I just ask you a little question?"
The specific holdout debt, it's $11.5 billion, but with interest and other unpaid debt, it's a lot more than that.
Mr. Blackman, can I ask you a question, sort of extra record?
Yeah.
Why would anyone lend money to Argentina with this sordid history?
In the past? You sound like Judge Cabranes footnote number 2.
I'm asking, why would anyone who can read ever lend money to Argentina?
Well, you asked the question about the coupon on this debt. It was at the time 11.5 or 12, which was a pretty hefty percentage.
The original bond?
Yeah. But in addition to that, people lend money. Argentina didn't default whimsically. There was a financial crisis in Argentina that was worse than the Great Depression. I mean, at the end of 2001, there was rioting in the streets. There were 4 presidents in the space of several weeks. The economy was so in the tank that kids were passing out in school from hunger. And I remember the first time I went down to Buenos Aires, it was like what you read about Weimar Germany. There were middle-class people in the street selling their possessions on street corners. That was the financial crisis. Okay, people lent money. These people didn't lend money at the time. These people bought in the secondary market at very steep discounts. Okay, but you asked the question. People lent money. Of course, they hoped to be paid back. They were warned in the disclosures that they were dealing with a sovereign, that if there was a default, there would be the Sovereign Immunities Act and other difficulties to collection.
Okay, Argentina was hurting. Argentina couldn't pay back the money. And Argentina's new ministers were looking at the world in early 2000. In the 1980s, the country lost a decade, as did all of Latin America, in the lost decade when the banks wouldn't give debt relief. And they had an economic crisis after Volcker raised rates and commodity problems. In the 90s, most of them had Brady programs and they recovered pretty well. But Argentina's program of the 90s, supported by the IMF and the World Bank, blew up. That's what happened in 2001. You could blame Argentina for not fulfilling the program very well or something, but the reality is the lost decade of the 80s, the lost decade of the 90s, the minister says, we got to bring this to an end. We need a very deep haircut of our debt. And in our plan, we are going to run a very large primary surplus, 3% a year. US, what are we running? Minus 4% a year? Most countries pretty minus now. This is a pretty healthy primary surplus. But creditors complained vigorously because it implied a 75% haircut on foreign debt. Just so I'm clear, 75% haircut is Argentina lent $1 and it wanted to give 25 cents back. Creditors, when Argentina proposed that in September 2003, were shocked because in the Brady plans that resolved the last decade of the 80s, they got 2/3 or 3/4 of their money back. The haircut was 25% or 1/3. Plus, if they missed interest for a few years, the country paid all that back. Argentina said, oh, I missed payments for 4 years. I'm not paying you any of that. And they were very upset, but Argentina was serious. We do not want to be back in crisis, and stuck to its guns. And what happened is the organized creditors attacked and attacked. That's all in the first 100 pages of the book. Organized creditors attacked in the press, and they went to the IMF and lobbied to cut off the IMF program. They're not playing fair. They're not negotiating in good faith. Argentina responded by raising its offer from 25 cents on the dollar to 34 cents on the dollar, plus a GDP warrant, which gave bonus payments if their GDP grew more than expected. And it did. After the fact, Argentina paid billions of more, and the net recovery of those who took its deal was about 50 cents on the dollar. But this was a really complicated deal. And as someone who did deals, I assure you this is as bad as it gets. Argentina defaulted on 152 different bonds in 7 different currencies under 8 different laws. Not only were there institutional investors all over the world, you know, the BlackRocks and the PIMCOs and the TCWs and the Fidelities, there were over 500,000 mom and pop retail investors. The biggest problem was Italy didn't have a very good regulatory system, and the Italian banks sold it to moms and pops. Happened is the big 6 or 7 banks sold it to the 300 or 400 regional banks who sold it to moms and pops. They did this because in the United States, regular savers will buy CDs or they'll buy mutual funds, right? In Italy, they bought government bonds. And in the 80s, let's say, they would buy Italian government bonds with a 10 or 12 or 13% yield. But then with the European Monetary Union, when Italy joins Germany with the euro, the yield on Italian government bonds goes from 13 to 3 or 3.5. And then grandma and grandpa and mom and pop come into the bank and they said, well, I can't live off 3%. These are 50, 60, 70-year-old people. What can I buy that gives me a 10% yield like I need? They said, well, I can give you an Argentina bond or a Russian bond for 10%. And which one do you want? And they all said Argentine bonds. Do you know why? Who knows the answer? No? They love Argentine football players. So this default, you feel sorry for Argentina, but you have to feel sorry for all the savers and the moms and pops. Germany had like 50,000, Japan maybe 30, 40,000. They had better regulation. Most of the buyers in Germany bought 250,000 or more. They wouldn't sell it to really small people. So anyway, with this messy holdings, how did Argentina, in a lot of dispute over the depth of the haircut, how did Argentina get its deal done? Well, there was one more problem. When I did deals, usually 99% of the time, the country works with the IMF. And before Ecuador comes and does a deal, or Venezuela or Brazil or whoever, the IMF mission chief comes up and says, we support the country, we have a program, and we've run our numbers. And in Uruguay's case, the managing director wrote a letter saying, it is essential for the success of the program that all creditors participate in the offer. So it's a legitimizing function. We've done our numbers and it's necessary economically. Well, Argentina, because the fights over the deal broke with the IMF, so Argentina came in and said, you got 34 cents on the dollar, and it didn't have the IMF standing next to it, legitimizing it. That was an experiment. How did Argentina sell it? On threats, mega threats, with more threats than anybody had ever seen. 3 types of threats in particular. Verbal threats. Argentina's good at this. if you don't take my deal, I won't pay you a penny. Contractual threats. They put something in the bond exchange offer document that cuffed its hands. It was a price match guarantee. So let's say 80% of the creditors take its deal at 34 cents on the dollar. And a lot of them are small investors. They're really afraid, well, what if I come in and I take your bad deal and a sophisticated large investor doesn't take the deal and you give them a better deal later? Argentina said, no, we'll protect you, because if I give someone who didn't take the deal a better deal, I will make up the difference to you. So if Argentina offered someone 34 cents, but it later offered someone else 50 cents, it would have to give the original participant 16% more value. In that way, if Argentina had a successful deal, it couldn't offer more under contract because it couldn't afford it. And it was a 10-year price match guarantee. So in effect, till December 31st, 2014, Argentina could not offer a better deal economically, put it in contract. So that's the second kind of threat. It was made to comfort small holders to come in the deal, but it was also the threat to people that don't come out. You're not going to get another deal for 10 years, which is a long time to wait. And the third thing it did was a legal threat. Because the truth is, when Argentina went out and started telling its story and opening its offer, in the first 2 weeks, nobody was coming in. So Argentina went to its Congress and passed a law where the Congress said, I forbid the government, the executive, from ever reopening this offer, from ever paying a court judgment, from even talking to the holdouts. They called it the lock law. And they told all the Italian people about that. And it helped get the deal done. It scared people into the deal. And when the final tally came in, more than half of the small Italian holders came in. Almost all the institutional investors came in. The aggregate result was 76%, which for a very tough deal is a very good result. The Economist, the stodgy British finance magazine, summed it up nicely. The Economist said, Argentina talked tough and won for now. They said for now because they said if Argentina didn't continue with much needed reforms, the country would be back in economic trouble. Prophetic words. We'll get to that in Q&A about what's happened since. Now that's part one. So we have this big fight over the deal, and it's a successful but suboptimal deal. Argentina got 76% with a great haircut. It's not paying a penny to the 24%, so financially it's in good shape. And the 76% got new bonds with low coupons, paid off over 30 years. Really, really good job. But what about the 24%? On the size of bonds, that was $20 billion worth of bonds, didn't take its deal, and many of them went to court to sue. So we have 2005 to 10 massive lawsuits, chaotic mass litigation. There were hundreds of lawsuits, lots of attachments, appeals, hearings, big sophisticated plaintiffs, medium-sized plaintiffs, class action plaintiffs, mom and pop plaintiffs, total mixed bag, totally uncoordinated. But as I said, the second impossible problem is it's actually hard to collect from a foreign sovereign. The sovereign immunity makes it very difficult. And so while these plaintiffs filed a lot of lawsuits, almost everything they did failed between 2005 and 10 is what I called failed attachments, or a game of catch and release. So who's heard of attachment as an idea? That a country defaults and creditors grab their stuff around the world. You've heard headlines and stories about that, chasing Argentina around the world. Well, it creates a lot of juicy headlines, but the reality is it mostly fails, and most of the time it's a game of catch and release, because first the court allows you to take it, and then the court says, oh no, you have to throw it back, like fishing. You don't have the license, you can't keep it. Creditors tried to attach airplane ship, bank accounts, bond counts central bank reserves, satellite guidance system, satellite launch slot on SpaceX. But what happened is, so when there's an attachment, the creditor does research and finds out, oh, I think there's a guidance system at Honeywell in New Jersey. So I'm going to do an attachment order on Honeywell to attach the guidance system. They go to the court in an ex parte emergency hearing, meaning Argentina's not there and they're not told about it. And they rush to the court and they say, could you please sign this temporary restraining order, a temporary attachment order that we serve and freezes the asset before Argentina can hear about it and take it out of the country. So the judge signs it, but it's only temporary because under law, they need to have an actual hearing. And so about 2 weeks later, the judge will have that order will be served. Argentina will be notified. There will be a notice of a hearing. Both sides will give briefs. The one side, why we can attach and keep this asset. In Argentina, why Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act means you can't keep it. And inevitably, in this 2005 to 10 period, Argentina won because when the judge read the very high bar of the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, he would say, this is Judge Thomas Beaker, say, I'm sorry, you can't keep it, release. And that's what happened. But can you imagine being this judge? It's a serious person, a federal judge, used to spending 2 or 3 hearings on a case. By 2010 is approaching 100 hearings, and it's all a waste of time because it all leads to nothing. And it's plaintiff after plaintiff wanting to get paid. And Argentina's doing well. The economy is recovering, and it's restructured a lot of its debt. And it's still saying, I'm not paying any of these guys. And because there's no bankruptcy, there's no way to stop these cases. And they're going on and on. So he's getting pretty exhausted. And so by 2010, we have a very particular type of drama in this book, which is Argentina wanted a deep discount, and it played tough, and it got a deep discount. And it was using sovereign immunity to avoid paying a penny to those who didn't take its deal. The plaintiffs, including some very litigious funds, they said, I have my legal rights and I'm going to sue you till the end of time, led by Elliott Associates, but they were not the only one. In the middle, you have this Judge Thomas P. Grisey, and he's getting frustrated. In 2010, the game pivots because Argentina in early 2010 has an opportunity. The bonds that were defaulted on that didn't come in the deal are trading really low, whereas the bonds it issued in the exchange are trading higher. They say, we will reopen our offer, we will lift our lock law, and you can get a second chance. 2/3 of the 20 billion said, thank you, I'm out. They haven't got a penny since 2001, and you're in 2010. So 2010 reopening, 2/3 take it. Argentina gets up to 92% at, let's say, a 50% discount, including the 34 cents on the dollar plus the warrant. Best trade in history by the numbers alone. Uruguay in 2003 did an external debt restructuring. All it did was move out the maturity of its debt 5 years. No principal haircut, no coupon reduction, and it had an 89% success rate. Argentina gets 92% rate with a maximum haircut and a very big coupon reduction. Argentina has won this game. But the tough investors are in the last 8%. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. I know some of you ate and said, well, maybe I can eat and run, but I'm going to give away books to people who ask good questions. I have a few here, so you can go, but there's more interesting stuff here. I do know people have classes, but I thought I'd mention that. So Elliott's waiting for this moment, and the other creditors basically know Elliott's going to do this. They come to the judge 3 weeks after Argentina gets to 92%. Argentina by now has 50 billion of reserves. There are only 7 billion of holdout bonds left. So Argentina has the money to pay them all off. And they go to the judge and say, well, Argentina could afford to pay all of it. They passed this law. They're not honoring the court. They're not paying your judgments. They've been difficult. It's time to do something about it. And they say, here's the argument. Attachment is failing. Argentina is willfully ignoring the judgments of the court. And we have an injunction that Argentina can't thumb its nose at. Here's the idea. The philosophical idea. These 92% have been getting paid, especially, say, take the 76 and 05. They got new bonds, a smaller amount, but they've been getting paid every coupon since 05. You're in late 2010, and those who took the deal, they're getting paid or are going to get paid on every semi-annual coupon payment. But these guys who didn't take the deal, they have not got paid a penny in over 10 years. The judge this comes to a hearing in 2011. They say that's unequal. And there's a covenant in the bonds that says Argentina has to treat all creditors equally. How can that be equal treatment if we get zero and they get paid in full? And how can we be treated equal if they pay them in full and they promised under their lock law that they would never, ever pay us a penny? Like, however you look at it, they've broken this covenant. And as a remedy, I'm saying every single semi-annual coupon payment, every time they make a payment, it's a new wound. They're stabbing us and breaching this covenant every 6 months. We have to stop it on the next coupon payment date. The way you stop this offense is you block the payment to the 92% unless they pay us in full. The attraction is it'll work because the Elliott lawyers read all the bond documents. They noticed, on page 344, all payments go through the Bank of New York. They can't thumb their nose to that order because while the order to pay equally can come from the judge in New York and Argentina can thumb its nose at it, the way it pays is it sends money from the Central Bank of Argentina to the Bank of New York in New York, who distributes the money all over the world. The Bank of New York cannot knowingly breach a New York court order. That would be aiding and abetting a crime, according to Argentina's lawyers. And the judge kind of argues with it because he doesn't really want to be in the middle of this, but he gets convinced, yeah, I think this works. And it's a good argument because the court is sick of this. And he spent, that's why I go into the hundreds of cases and the failed attachments. He's tired of this. He wants it over. And he gets really frustrated with Argentina and asks for help, which I'll go into in a second. But before that, let's listen. How do you think the 92% felt about this, huh? Do you want your payments blocked because these 8% want to get paid in full when you've taken 50 cents on the dollar? And mind you, the 92%, they're not getting 100. They're going to get 3 or 4 times 100 because there's par and missed coupons and interest on interest. So they're going to get a lot more. So let's play the second recording where the lawyer for the 92% talks to the Second Circuit about how they feel about this.
Frustration here, all right? You've got Argentina and hasn't paid its bonds, and there doesn't seem to be any way to get them to pay those bonds. And what the court is trying to find is it's trying to find how can we fashion an order that somehow makes them pay. And what I'm saying is that there are certain ways that you can do it. There are certain ways that the Congress has said you can't do it. But what the law, I suggest, in the Constitution is quite clear, is that you can't say to us, we're going to hold you hostage. We're going to say that you don't have a right to accept your lawfully negotiated contractual payments. Remember, Your Honor, these were bondholders that started off with the same kind of bonds. They exchanged them. And at the time of that exchange, which was sponsored not just by private parties, but governments, because it was important to get it done, what they took were these obligations. And both sides have agreed in the district court that we have an unconditional right to that payment. We have an unconditional right to that payment. The suggestion that somehow our right to that payment is conditioned on something else is nowhere in the record, and there's no evidence to that. The question is, can that unconditional right to be paid, for us to be paid, can that be broken? Can that be blocked? Can that be prevented? Even for a good purpose, and particularly done in a case in which we're not even a party.
Well, the courts did do it. Judge Grisey did it, and the Second Circuit affirmed it. And here's my interpretation, which is through the book, which is why before Judge Grisey gave the violation of the covenant, which I explained, the equal treatment, he turned to Argentina's table to the lawyers and said, okay, well, I'm paraphrasing, and say, I don't really want to do this, but how are we going to solve the problem? How are they going to pay these bonds, deal with these claims and judgments? And Argentina's court lawyer basically had no instruction from the country and said, we'll get around to it someday. This is September 28th, 2011. You're basically 10 years after the default. This judge has been working on it for a decade. He said, well, we did an exchange offer in 2005 and we did an exchange offer in 2010. I guess there'll be something else sometime. So the judge, he wants this problem solved. He imposed the injunction. He found a contract violation, but he did not rule on the injunction. Then nothing really happened, and he signed a sort of order about that. And there was a hearing later in February 23rd, 2012, where they came to talk about the injunction. And the judge didn't want to do it. He said, he always kept the settling investors apart from the holdouts. All the way through the 2005 offer, I promise you, the holdouts tried to interfere all sorts of ways. And he said, no, you can't do it. No, you can't do it. He pushed them away. He ruled against them. He was Argentina's best friend, totally protected the deal. He made more rulings in their favor in the 2010. But when it came to now, he's like, look, I protected you. I've ruled for you on sovereign immunity for 10 years. Are you going to help me solve this? And he told Elliott's counsel, I don't think you have the right to interfere with these payments. But there was no alternative. He turns to Argentina's counsel. He says, what are we going to do? And they said, oh, it's illegal. You can't do this order. It's not allowed under the law, blah, blah, blah. He said, I'm just going to do it. And then he said, I don't know if I'm going to be overruled by the Second Circuit, but this is something I have to do. Then at the Second Circuit, they had a long hearing. They had a second long hearing where they were going to impose the injunction. But the way the injunction was written, remember what I said is, if they pay anything to the 92, meaning a semi-annual coupon payment, like one payment out of the 30-year flow, if you pay one little payment, you have to pay the 8% everything in full. The par and the future interest and the interest on interest, like the whole thing at once. Even paying $1 million here, you have to pay $10 billion over here. And so the Second Circuit wrote a letter to Argentina and said, well, we know you don't like this thing. Is there an alternative payment plan you would abide by? And Argentina wrote a letter back, which I will paraphrase, which was something akin to my way or the highway. They basically said, I have my 2005 and 10 offer. If they want to take something, they have to take what I offered. Basically saying, I don't care what your court thinks. I don't care about your judgments. I unilaterally made an offer. Everybody has to take it. And when they wrote their opinion, they called Argentina a uniquely recalcitrant debtor. So Argentina ran out of appeals in June 2016 when the Supreme Court did not accept hearing this wacky, weird deal issue. And in June 30th was the next payment. So they had 14 days. Argentina had a choice. So Argentina loses in court, but the ball is back in Argentina's court. It always comes back to the sovereign. If the sovereign doesn't want to pay, you can't do anything about it. So Argentina has a choice. Capitulate and pay the holdouts in full, everything up front, or default on everybody. You said you wanted equal treatment? I'll treat everybody equally. So we're public policy students here. What would you advise the president to do? Hold your nose and get it over with and get back to normal? Or stick it to the bastards? So anyway, let's consider another factor, because we're talking about law, we're talking about economics. You forgot to mention the most important thing in the room, which is politics. So we have the last audio-visual sample here is a video. What I didn't mention, in 2012, Elliot captured this beautiful three-masted ship of Argentina's called La Fragata Libertad. You can pass this around. Look at this beautiful ship. This is the most beautiful ship I've ever seen in my life. Okay? This Fragata Libertad, liberty. This is like the Statue of Liberty to Argentines. And Elliot gets the idea when it has a crew of 327. It has visitors from other navies. It does state visits, marching bands and ambassadors and generals. And it's friendship visits. But when it goes to Ghana, the next day they get a court order to impound it. How did that read in the newspaper? So Argentina, it's a Navy ship, international law. Come on, you can't take a Navy ship. So Argentina uses the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea and files papers against Ghana. And there's a hearing in December 2012 at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in Hamburg. And Argentina wins unanimously, and they order Ghana to refuel the ship and send it home, which they do. And then the ship arrives in the port of Mar del Plata, which is not far from Buenos Aires, and there's a homecoming of all homecomings, the mother of all homecomings, and there's the president, the cabinet, the crew, the captain, and tens of thousands of supporters in the street welcoming home the victims of the vulture funds. Let's watch this, and while you watch it, and I don't care if you know Spanish or not, just feel the emotion and ask yourself, is this president going to capitulate and pay the holdouts in June 2014, or is she going to stick it to him?
No miento, no engaño, me interesa la patria, defiendo la bandera, quiero que la memoria de él, de mi compañero, quede bien en alto, y por eso voy a seguir luchando siempre, desde cualquier lugar, por el bienestar del pueblo, por la grandeza de la nación y por la felicidad de todos los argentinos. Gracias, muchas gracias por todo el aguante de estos 70 días. Muchas gracias a los integrantes de la fragata. Gracias a sus familiares. Gracias a todos los que acompañaron y pusieron garra y lo que hay que poner para defender a la patria. ¡Viva la patria! ¡Viva la patria! ¡Viva la patria! ¡Viva la Argentina! Gracias, muchas gracias.
Okay, she didn't pay. But the story has a double twist ending. The first is, how do you think the 92% pay feel about being left in default for almost 2 years? Well, the US Treasury was ready for this, because when the rulings started going bad in 2012, they're like, we have a problem here. So they said, let's put the vultures out of business. They said, let's put a voting clause in sovereign bonds. We're not going to get bankruptcy. Nobody's ever going to vote on that. We're not going to get it through the Congress. We're not going to get it through the IMF. We're not going to get an international treaty. It would take forever. But we can put a voting clause in sovereign bonds that if a country has 30 billion of bonds and 75% of the holders vote to take a deal, by contract, it will be legally binding on 100%. And in Argentina, we had 76%, right? So if Argentina had 76%, everyone would have been in, there would have been no litigation, it would have been over in 2005, no problem. And after that default, the market proposed that, and all issuers have used those clauses since then. Today, 86% of sovereign bonds have them. It would be more, but there were still a lot of outstanding bonds. So it happened, a country has some bonds mature, and then they refinance with the new clauses. And it's been 10 years. Most have matured and been refinanced. In another 10 years, it'll be 99%. So the world has learned from this chaos to change the contracts to make up for the holdout creditor problem. So one of the two problems was solved. And that's the summary of my book. I mean, really, the world got collective action voting clauses because of those messy Argentina cases. That's what the book is really about. So that's the first twist ending. The second twist ending is the opposition won the 2015 election, and Mauricio Macri said, I'm going to fix this. And he sent two young bankers who had never worked in government up to New York and said, don't come back till you fixed it. And they actually, like, there's no way we're going to pay everything they want, because with the par and the interest and the interest on interest, some of these guys were on 4 times par, and 300 million of the 7 billion bonds were owed 10 times par. So these 300 million had judgments for 3 billion because they had funky derivative interest coupons. They're like, we're not paying that. They said, we'll be reasonable. We'll pay 100, we'll pay interest, but we're not going to pay like everything you want. So they went up and they started cutting deals with people. And there was a special master, a sort of mediator from the court. And at first, that guy did not trust Argentina at all, but they kind of convinced him they were real. They started cutting deals. They cut deals with the remaining Italian moms and pops, which covered $1 billion. They cut a deal on another $1 billion. And they went to Judge Grisey and said, you know, we're not being uniquely recalcitrant. We've changed. And some of the creditors wrote a letter to Judge Grisey. They've changed their behavior. We've settled, lift the injunction so they can raise money to pay us. Elliott and the other guys were not happy, because what happened is he immediately indicatively lifted the injunction, took away all their bargaining power, and they were forced to take the same discount the early settlers took, which cost them $1 billion. And so by being reasonable and by really being smart about how they negotiated, Argentina had a very face-saving solution to this messy problem. And it's really quite a brilliant ending, nothing anyone would have expected. So the last chapter is brilliant. And those two officials got more senior jobs within the government of Macri. Macri's government did not end up particularly well because it wasn't up to solving the country's problems. But with the failed following government in the election of Milei, those two heroes of the settlement of 2016, Caputo and Basile, Luis Caputo is now the Minister of Economy, the lead minister in economic policy, and Basile is the head of the central bank. So we have continuity to today of the story told in this book. And so it makes it fun. The other thing is I'm a senior fellow at the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Business and Government, and my faculty advisor is Federico Sturzenegger, who's also a top minister in the government. So I'm proud to be here to talk to all of you, but there's a very remarkable story to have finished this book in 2022 and not know what would happen in Argentina to have the dramatic events of the last 2 years happen. But thank you for listening. And now José and Ignacio will expose ourselves to questions.
Well, thank you so much, Gregory. I was so excited each time that I saw this video of the Fragata Libertad. I said, wow, we are Latin American. We can defeat the vulture funds. No, we can't. Because time is a little bit running out, and Gregory made a binding offer. I'm a lawyer here about some books, so I will give you the opportunities from Q&A. I will take maybe 3, and we move on like this. So here. Okay. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you.
Thank you. Okay. Hi. So I wanted to ask, with the introduction of CACs, have you seen any effect in terms of total flows going to emerging markets like Argentina? Are creditors still enthusiastic about emerging market debt, or have they pulled back given that their kind of recourse options are limited?
No, the markets are fine. They were consulted. They think it's market positive. It makes it an orderly market, and it makes no difference. The market's concerned about other things, but here's a book.
Oh, great! Investors will always love emerging market. I don't know why, but they love that. Okay, from the back, I don't know, it's too many people. You guess? Yeah, that one, perfect.
Hi. I want to ask, like, when they were like defaulting the debt,
Yeah.
how does the other so they want to borrow more money at the same time, like how does the other creditors, for example, if there are some countries that are in favor with the relationship with Argentina, would they still borrow money to them, or like they discount the default risk more than the political benefit from the relationship of the countries?
Yeah, when a country defaults, it has a complicated mess of defaults. We've been talking today about the commercial creditors, the bondholders, but you have your loans from the IMF and the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank or the African or Asian Development Banks. You have your loans from the US and China and India and Saudi Arabia, and then you have your bonds. So what happens is countries don't default on the IMF and the World Bank. You keep paying that, but they're long dated and low coupon. That's not a problem. Generally, the US, France, Germany, China will give some kind of debt relief, but there tends to be some kind of negotiation to make sure it's equally shared. In Argentina's case, they only had 5 billion of debt to bilateral lenders and 100 billion in bonds. So there was like no relevance of the bilateral part. What we're seeing now is cases where the biggest loan is to China. So the thing we talk about is that negotiation, and we barely talk about the bonds. But there are different types of complexities which get very political. But generally, if countries run out of money, they need to pay for medicine. The IMF will keep funding them with approval from the board while they're in the process of restructuring their debt to keep the lights on. And that's very important for negotiating because the country can be in default for 5 years while keeping the lights on. So that interim support from bilateral or multilateral lenders is an important part of the game.
Indeed, Gregory, and you explained very well that one of the impossibilities in the Argentine case was the coordination among bondholders. But as you perfectly well say, today's could be even more complicated because on the one side, we have new players like China and coordinated with China, as Zambia, for instance, debt restructuring process demonstrated is quite complicated. But in addition, we have creditor judgments, for instance, creditors that have an exit award, an investment award, that are not bondholders. So coordinating such differentiation of creditors is quite complicated. We have another question. We have time. Okay, in the middle. Yes. Yeah. By the way, somebody returned a book. I don't know why.
No, that was when I...
I got it. Okay. It was quite strange.
My question is, was the recalcitrance worth it? If you weigh, given 2020 hindsight, if you weigh the benefit of the haircuts versus the reputational consequences and all of the other mess that they had to get into, was it worth it?
Argentina defaulting? Argentina had absolutely no choice. Argentina was so broken, had so much debt, had so little growth, it had no choice but to default and devalue. Sometimes there's no money and you can't pay. The whole judgment here is, did the cleanup process have to be so messy? Did Argentina have to offer 25 cents in the offer dollar? Did creditors have to demand 75 cents on the dollar? Why didn't they just agree somewhere in the middle? And then Argentina got 76% done, but it waited 5 years to give a second chance. What if they gave a second chance in May 2005 and 92% accepted it, and then there would have been a lot less litigation? And then what happens if Argentina decided to settle in July 2014 rather than getting back into default? So I'm much less concerned with the moral question in Argentina's case. Now, what you say is if you're Kenya today, in Kenya, it's ambiguous. Are we better off getting a kind of expensive bond and avoiding default? Or should we default and have a 4-year mess and our economy plunges because of the uncertainty? These are very difficult questions. And for me, it's not moral, it's economic. A minister has to do what's in the best judgment of the country, fully considering the consequences. And that's why I wrote the book, because I want countries who are considering if they must or they might, how this works. You shouldn't naively decide to default. And if you default, you got to be ready for the battles you're going to have. So unlike Argentina, you don't make some of the mistakes they did. You want to clean it up like I did with Jamaica in 3 months and cleanly and get back to a normal economy. Argentina is not back to a normal economy today. They never recovered from the default of 2001. They had some good reforms under a minister for 4 years, and then the president said, fired. And then they started overspending, and then they fought hard with the holdout creditors, and they're printing money. They're forcing the central bank to give money to the finance ministry, and people get they restructure their debt again in 2020. The people get so sick of the constant financial crisis, they vote by a large majority for Javier Milei in his chainsaw. Argentina's never done that. They've always voted for the person promising handouts. And I promised I'd mention the US. We're now all voting for the people promising handouts. We're acting like Argentina, while Argentina is saying, hey, let's be careful with money and debt. So we're in a kind of topsy-turvy world politically right now.
Well, yeah, maybe some creditor will seize the USS Constitution. I don't know. It's going to be crazy. Okay, we'll have maybe time for a last question. Yeah, gentleman here.
Thanks. I found your description of the judge quite humorous and interesting, and I was wondering how much discretion there really is, because it seemed to be that there was some room for personal judgment on the side of the judge. So I was wondering, within these negotiations in general, how much room is there for personal discretion within the judiciary?
Well, a lot of people have said this about my book, is it is a good case study of how judges work, how they deal with difficult cases. And a top investor who worked at my firm, which is Citibank, for probably 35 years, and he's very senior at Apollo now, he said to me, I thought judges just read the law. This is very emotional. But when you read this, I present the case like you're the judge. Like, okay, you're hearing this from this side, what would you do? And I think it's not easy, but we have 1 district court judge, we have 3 appeals court judges, and we have 9 Supreme Court judges. We have a system that assures justice and review. You're not going to have some emotional ruling last. If it was bad, then it will be overturned. So it's a very thoughtful, rigorous system that we have. And he was affirmed on this stuff. And so it's a fascinating study in how the law works, and I learned a lot doing it, and I have the greatest respect.
It is a very good question indeed, because one of the problems currently facing by public debt litigation is that all these measures, injunctions, are in the side of the so-called equity in the US law, meaning that the judge has a broader discretion to take basically any kind of decision. Nowadays, Argentina is facing a similar problem with the YPF case that could end in a turnover petition. And another very interesting case to analyze the discretion of judges is Venezuela, with the Delaware court that is conducting an action sale process of a US refinery. I think that time has run out, but Gregory may stay a little bit while if you want to comment. I want to thank Fernando Garcia for organizing this. It's been quite a pleasure for me to return to the Go Lab. Thank you.